Honor Club, where honor is real.
What's up, wrestling fans? Welcome to Old School in Session. My name is Kevin Eck, and it is my pleasure to introduce the Ring of Honor Director of Operations and former promoter for WCW, the NWA's Georgia Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions, and the AWA. He is, as you know, the man who makes old school cool, Gary Juster. Gary, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Kevin. Good afternoon.
Well, our topic today can be summed up in one word. Actually, I don't know if it's technically a word, but it is certainly in the pro wrestling lexicon, and that is woo. Gary, have you ever wooed?
No, I don't woo.
Oh, I can't get you to woo.
No woo.
Okay.
All right.
No woo.
No woo. I don't do the chop at the Braves game either. I was always anti-chop, but although I'm
hold on though. I can't let this go. I did see you chop Bryan Johnson. Did I not?
That was in honor of Ric Flair.
Yes, at ROH unauthorized. Yeah, I know you don't like to talk about that too much, but you are undefeated inside the ring.
That was kind of a holiday Colt Cabana comedy skit.
Yes.
A one and done, as they say.
One and done.
But, one of the interesting things about Ric Flair, and you probably already know this, and probably some of the listeners do, because we've talked about it before, but when I was born, I was actually delivered by Dr. Richard Flair. Ric Flair's father. Now, Rick was adopted, but his dad, Richard Flair, for whom he was named, was my mother's OBGYN, and also many of her friends. So Dr. Flair was kind of a household name in our home. So it was something that I was just fated to meet Rick down the line. Oddly enough, although Rick was from Edina, Minnesota, and I was from a suburb called Golden Valley, Rick went for a short time to my high school, but he was 5 years ahead of me, so I never knew him. But he went 1 year to Golden Valley High School, and then later ended up going to military school. So I have this kind of, I guess, really old relationship with Rick. And then, of course, he was on our second Baltimore show when he worked with Jack Briscoe in April of 1984.
Well, I'll tell you, plenty of people can say that they go way back with Ric Flair, but literally with this connection with his father, Dr. Flair, you can literally say that your connection, sort of one removed from Ric Flair, literally goes back to before you were born.
Yeah. So anyway, and then once I got to know Rick, Rick would, of course, he'd like to tell that story to people.
Yeah.
Rick was always, as you know, extremely gregarious, loved to party, loved to show kind of the new kid around, whoever that might have been. And when it was me, there were many nights out on the town with Rick. And I only did it for a short time, but it was always an adventure.
Well, I was going to say, you could probably only do it for a short time to keep up with Rick. The stories are legendary.
Very, very short time.
Well, is there a story that comes to mind along those lines of going out on the town with Rick that would be suitable and that you would feel comfortable with telling?
Well, the one Rick likes to tell, and it's suitable to tell, is that the Crockett Cup in Baltimore in '87, I believe, was a big deal, and plenty of people came in. There was just a lot of partying going on, and I got a call about 2 or 3 in the morning, and had to go over to Rick's hotel. They were up partying all night, and Rick had maxed out on his credit card and was not about to stop. And I had to give him my credit card. And the other thing about Rick, Rick's history with money has not been as good as his history in the ring. Rick was always known to spend a lot of money. And that was just part of his gimmick, part of his, styling and profiling gimmick. But when Rick was working on top as champion for Jim Crockett Promotions, we used to have Jim Crockett Promotions had a rule that we could give out draws to the wrestlers. And there was a $200 limit that they could get against their weekly pay. And but Rick, we were told, could get pretty much whatever he wanted, and Rick would often get $700, $800, $1,000, and that would be his spending money, and he would go out and have a great time. One of the things that I always found amazing about Rick, and it's nothing new, but I was just thinking about it, as before we were going to talk. In the era that I worked, starting in the 80s and going on the mid 80s through the mid to late 90s, Flair had programs and worked main events with just a wide array of amazing talent. Harley Race, Ricky Steamboat, Dusty Rhodes, Wahoo, Ron Garvin, Sting, Lex Luger, Terry Funk, Blackjack Mulligan, and lots more. Those are just ones, kind of off the top of my head. And Kevin, you've seen many of those.
Absolutely.
You saw many of the shows in Baltimore and probably along the East Coast. Flair and Dusty had an amazing program together that went on for years and years. One of the greatest angles in my era, and I think in the Crockett era, was when Flair broke Dusty's leg in the Omni in Atlanta. And I remember Dusty telling me about it in Baltimore one night. We had the Baltimore Arena had a bunch of small rooms in the back in the dressing area, a couple of big rooms and then a handful of small rooms. And Dusty had one room that was his room, and everybody knew that. And Dusty would call me in there and and tell me things, which was great. This was back in the day when Baltimore was really on fire. And he said, he goes, I'm telling you, he goes, Rick's going to break my leg in the Omni. And then he explained the whole angle to me. And they actually had a doctor in Charlotte, a Dr. Aswanek, who would go on TV every week with updates on Dusty's progress.
I remember that.
And when we came back in Baltimore, it was Flair versus Dusty. That's the main event. We talked about that last week. That was also the Road Warriors on the Russians. And that was our first sellout in Baltimore on a Tuesday evening, I believe in 1986. So it was, Flair was just able to go 60 minutes in the ring with virtually any opponent. And he drew big money for years and years, and just, became the legendary character that he is. He's basically a household name.
Well, Flair and Dusty, that was a match that was it was magic. And their feud went on for years. I mean, Rick took the title from Dusty the first time in 1981. And that was the first time Rick won the championship. And it just went on for years. The thing that I always found interesting, though, was you heard behind the scenes, and I don't know how much you can speak to this, was that obviously you had these two huge egos with Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair. Dusty a lot of times was the booker, Rick was the champion, and that I guess they were, you would never say they weren't friendly, but that there was some tension or some competition because they were both such big stars and because of the positions they were in. Did you ever witness any of that?
I think that the two of them had, great respect for one another, professional respect. But yes, they had their moments, but nothing, I don't think anything ever really serious. They both, had big egos and well-deserved. And big egos will sometimes clash, especially when everyone's, looking for that number one spot.
Well, it's no doubt that they had magic in the ring, as I said, and they made a lot of money together all over the country. It was a match, like I said, that never got old. The promos between the two, I mean, they were both such larger-than-life characters. Probably the most famous Dusty Rhodes promo of all time is the Hard Times promo.
Absolutely.
Which came out of the angle where Rick and the Four Horsemen broke his leg. I mean, it's just a masterclass in promos with, Dusty asking fans to, touch your hand on the TV screen and feel my hand. I mean, this was just unbelievable stuff. And, certainly Rick with his promos, Rick as the antagonist. And I don't know if you remember, but around the time that happened, Rick was sort of this tweener character as the NWA World Champion a lot of time was. And he was, sort of a babyface for a long time in Charlotte. But when they did the angle when they attacked Dusty, that's when Rick became full-on heel again and was the dirtiest player in the game and the number one heel in the business. And it was just, again, such great chemistry with Dusty being this man of the people and Rick being this, elitist and this, guy who'll do anything to win. I mean, it was just unbelievable, the two of them. And
and you say that, as you said, that started back in '81 and went on for years. And Rick was so durable. In the mid '90s, I think it was around '96, WCW was struggling, and we finally came back in the arenas with Flair versus Randy Savage working on top.
Right.
And that brought us back, for a big period. And that happened a lot with WCW. When we needed ratings, when we needed something big, we always called on Rick, and he always delivered. So his reputation is well deserved, and he was just an extremely durable character in terms of in the ring, on the mic, and on the town.
No question. And I think one of the interesting things about Rick and his legacy is when he was on top back in the mid to late 80s, and Hogan was on top in the WWF, because the WWF had such more of a national, well, not even a national footprint. WCW and the NWA, obviously at that time, they were national as well. But from the casual person, everyone knew Hulk Hogan. Everyone didn't necessarily know Ric Flair, but it's funny because today everyone does know Ric Flair. Rick has become as much, at least in my opinion, as part of pop culture, and I think especially in professional sports culture, he's become as much of an icon there as Hulk Hogan, if not maybe even more so among professional athletes of today. Rappers today have Ric Flair songs, and that national celebrity status, that mainstream, I guess is the word I was searching for, that mainstream celebrity status that eluded him when he was arguably the greatest performer in the business, he has that now. And I think that's really cool to see. That's
a really interesting point. And I think social media probably has a lot to do with that. Just the fact that all kinds of Rick's antics over the years are now available on social media. Some of those great interviews that you talked about, and matches and appearances. And Rick also really enjoys, to this day, being with other professional athletes, kind of being, now that it's the pandemic, he's not out on the town. And of course he had some serious health issues a few years back, but Rick really enjoyed being out there with Charles Barkley, or whoever his kind of, his athlete buddies might be. And at one time in North Carolina, and I kind of find this hard to believe, but apparently it's true, the Republican Party even approached Rick and wanted him to run for governor, which fortunately never happened. Rick and I have laughed about that many times, had he been a candidate.
He mentioned that to me one time in an interview that I did with him back when I was with the Baltimore Sun. And I think his reason for not wanting to run was, I think he even used the term, too many skeletons in the closet.
Well, and really they're not even in the closet.
That's true. They are out there for all to see in more ways than one.
Yeah, he made that pretty clear on this ESPN show that he did, the 30-minute show.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's funny too, talking about Rick, his legacy being the greatest and of all time and things of that nature, no pun intended. When I wrote a story on him for the Baltimore Sun back in 1997, I think it was, and I was asking him about his status, being regarded by so many as being the greatest and so forth. And I'll never forget, he said to me, he said, well, do I think I'm the greatest? Absolutely. Do I want you to quote me on saying that? He goes, no, I don't, because I'll get heat. And then he paused and he goes, but now if you want to say it, and if you want to write it, in your opinion, that's okay with me. Like, okay. You know, the other thing with that is, and this was sort of my, well, this was my first moment with ever being, I guess for lack of a better term, a part of the show. And I don't know if you remember this, but I did that interview with Rick in '97. It was right before, I think it was a Nitro. And the next night he came out on Nitro. I'm sitting in the crowd. He came out to do an interview with Gene Okerlund, and he reaches into it. He was doing an angle with Bret Hart at that point. He was in a program with Bret. And if you remember, Bret was writing a column in the Calgary Sun. And Rick starts reaching into his pocket, his shirt pocket, you know, under his suit jacket. And he mentions, you know, Bret writes a column in the Calgary Sun. Let me read to you what they're saying about the Nature Boy in the Baltimore Sun. And he pulled out the article and quoted from it. And I'm sitting there like with my mouth open. It was amazing.
That's great.
Rick was quoting from my article on Nitro. And I remember Gene Okerlund's just kind of ad-lib response when Rick said the Baltimore Sun. Gene says, nationally known publication, respected all over the world.
Yeah, sounds very much like Gene.
Yes. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Another funny Rick story I have, well, it's not really funny, but again, maybe a little impact that I had was before WrestleMania in 2008. There was a press conference. And this was when Rick was having his big retirement match against Shawn Michaels. This was the day before there was a press conference. And I was called on to ask the first question. And I asked Rick just, you know, what it would mean to – I didn't want him to break kayfabe because obviously the angle was if he lost the match, he had to retire. But if he won the match, he could continue wrestling. But I think we all knew that this was going to be his retirement match. But I phrased the question in such a way of, if this is your last match, you know, what are your emotions heading into it? And Rick barely got out one word, and his lips started quivering, and his eyes welled up, and Rick just broke down and started crying right there, which I know is no surprise to people. Later on, we saw Rick crying all the time. We hadn't seen it a whole lot at that point, and I just was like, oh my God, I just made Ric Flair cry.
Rick was always very emotional, and he cried several times with me just in conversations because, you know, there were various things going on in the WCW years that frustrated him, and booking and things that are well documented. So yes, Rick was always, you know, an extremely emotional person, always one, you know, for hugging, and, you know, Rick's a very personable guy. Rick was always like an extremely emotional, you know, very, you know, affectionate kind of person in terms of his praise of people. And Rick in private was actually very self-deprecating when it came to, you know, he knew he wasn't one of the tough guys. He wasn't a Harley Race or a Wahoo. He wasn't a guy that you wanted to have your back in a street fight. He was a great worker in the ring and great on the mic. And, you know, arguably, you know, some will say the greatest of all time. Others, you know, will say, you know, Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin, go back to Lou Thesz. I guess it depends on what era it is. But, you know, Rick's place in wrestling history as arguably the greatest performer of his era is certainly there.
Well, obviously anything like that is subjective, and sports fans love to have those debates over, you know, Mount Rushmores, who should be on there. Just, you know, I think you and I may have even talked about this a little bit on past episodes. If I had to pick my pro wrestling Mount Rushmore, I'm going Lou Thesz, Bruno Sammartino, Hulk Hogan, and Ric Flair. And I would put that as arguably the four biggest stars of all time, for the biggest draws, for the most influential. when you talk about longevity. And certainly you can make an argument for other people. There's plenty more people you could consider. Yeah, no offense to a guy like Steve Austin, but his run, as spectacular as it was, and as much money as he drew, and it was such a boom period, probably the biggest boom period in our business's history. It was just relatively short compared to the longevity of the four guys I mentioned, and certainly Rick, well into his 50s, as you said, like still when WCW needed to pop a rating or to draw a crowd at a house show, he was still the go-to guy.
Yeah, and I won't argue with your Mount Rushmore. I'm partial also to Nick Bockwinkel, and another guy who worked with Roddy was Roddy Piper, who worked with Flair all through the years and had, drew huge money in the Carolinas. But one of the things that I think you and I have talked about before, and that's why it's sometimes hard to measure one era against another or one type of performer against another. But Rick was the last of the NWA champions when there was an alliance. And later, of course, he became a company champion for Jim Crockett Promotions and for WCW, WWF. But before that, when the alliance was together, Rick was the last of those. Lou Thesz was arguably the greatest of those for several reasons. But the alliance champion in those days would work usually 300 nights or so a year, and would work literally all over the world, and would work all kinds of different styles. They'd go to Japan, they'd go to Mexico, they'd work all kinds of territories in the US and Canada. So to be able to do that successfully, and I say Rick was the last and one of the greatest, but there was Harley and both of the Funks and Gene Kiniski, and the list goes on. But that was something that was a really, really hard thing to pull off successfully. And the guys who did that, I think, have that special place in wrestling history.
You mentioned an interesting point about the NWA World Champion traditionally in the old days being a tough guy or being a legitimate shooter, someone who could handle themselves because there were double crosses that could happen in the ring. And that Rick wasn't necessarily one of those type of tough guys, didn't see himself as that way. I don't think he really was considered one of those guys. Why do you think the NWA board took the chance on Rick in 1981 to hold the championship? Was it that maybe times had changed to the point where they didn't expect a double cross? Or was it just that he was so good in the ring as a performer and could draw so much money for a lot of different promoters that's why they felt comfortable enough to put him in that position? I guess the only other guy that sort of comes to mind before him was the original Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, who I also believe was not considered a shooter or a tough guy, but again, was a huge draw and a huge personality.
It's a real good question, and I wish there were some NWA members that were still alive that I could ask. Because that is a good question, and Rick was not one of the, like I said, one of those tough guys like Harley and Lou Thesz and some of the other guys that we mentioned. And the answer is probably a combination of the two things that you suggested. One, that the business had changed, especially with cable television coming into its own, and the other just was someone who was willing to do that, had the durability to do it, who could make the local guys look really good, someone who was trustworthy, and I think they took a chance with Rick, and he performed.
Do you think, in your opinion, that Rick was, again, obviously the NWA World Champion, especially when he was traveling from territory to territory, his job was to make the local challenger look good in defeat? The NWA champion was going to walk out still the champion, but hopefully by the way the match was laid out and the finish, that the challenger was even stronger than before for having held their own, and in many cases seemingly should have won the title, but for whatever reason didn't. Rick was very good at that, but do you think he was almost, in some instances, maybe even too giving or too generous? I mean, I remember matches on TV, even against a guy like a Sam Houston, who was a fine worker in his own right, and was one of your upper card I won't call him an enhancement guy, but he was not a guy that was certainly ever going to be in main events or semi-main events. But I remember matches where, Sam Houston would toss Ric Flair around like a rag doll. You think Rick was ever too generous?
Rick loved to sell. I mean, he absolutely loved to sell. He loved to bleed. And I think he got a lot of that from Ray Stevens, who he kind of, in many ways, modeled himself after. The head first dive into the turnbuckle, the flip in the turnbuckle, the begging for mercy, the low blows, that kind of stuff. Similar style. Ray loved to sell also. So yeah, that was. Did he oversell? Ole Anderson, will tell you, was critical of Rick. I think I didn't read his book, but I've been quoted or excerpts from it where he denies that Rick was such a great worker because he, quote, had the same match every night. Rick did incorporate a lot of the same spots into his matches at night. But we didn't, in those days, people didn't see that same match because they didn't watch him night after night. They only watched it, in their town. But anyway, Rick, yes, he loved to sell. Did he oversell and give too much? I guess it's a matter of opinion. It certainly did not detract from his drawing power.
No, absolutely. I would definitely agree with that point. I had an interesting one question. I meant to ask you this before. I don't think I ever did. When you had a guy like when Rick was the NWA champion, this was a match specifically that we had in Baltimore. Right after Sergeant Slaughter had left the WWF, he was a free agent. I don't think he had officially committed to the AWA yet at that point. You brought him in not long after he left and had Ric Flair against Slaughter for the NWA championship in Baltimore. When you have a guy like Slaughter who isn't part of the National Wrestling Alliance, who actually decides what the finish is going to be? Was this still at the point where like the NWA board or anyone had to get involved to make sure that the finish went down as they wanted it to go down?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that one up. That was a show where that match, if you recall, was added at the last minute, maybe 2 weeks before. The tickets had not been selling well. The house was really down, and I was complaining to Jim Crockett about it because we would talk every day and we'd always go over the advances. And he said, you know what? He said, I think Flair might be available that night. Something had happened somehow. I don't know if there was a cancellation, but somehow he became available. And he said, well, the card's all booked on that. Who do you think we can put him on? We just added that match. And Slaughter was available. So that match was just kind of made on the fly with only a couple of weeks to go. And whatever, Bob Remus, Sergeant Slaughter, great guy, by the way. I love Bob. I've known him for many, many years. We're also fellow Minneapolitans.
Yeah, another guy that was trained by Vern. Trained by Vern, right?
Yes, and a really good guy. So there would have not been any issue in terms of a finish. Bob, Sergeant Slaughter was the consummate professional. Whatever he was asked, he would have done. And if it was a matter of protecting him in some way, and I don't recall the finish, maybe you as a historian may even have records on these things.
Oh, I can tell you, I remember the finish vividly. It was the first time I ever saw a Dusty finish. Sarge, I think there was a ref bump. Sarge threw Rick over the top rope. Rick threw Sarge over the top rope. Second referee comes out. Sarge gets the pin, 1, 2, 3. He's handed the belt. He's announced as the new champion. First referee comes to his senses, says he saw Slaughter get tossed over the top rope, so he wins by disqualification.
There you go.
I have a question here that comes from our good friend Rhett Titus. And I don't know if you'll know this one, but he wanted me to ask this. He used the hashtag #AskGary on Twitter. He said, how close was WCW to pulling off Flair versus Hogan at MSG in 1994? And I'll let you answer, but I'm going to guess probably not close at all because Garden wasn't an option, was it?
It was not close at all. The Garden was only willing to give us what they then called the Paramount. It's now called, it's been kind of shut down during COVID. It's the Hulu Theater. And it was originally called the Felt Forum when they first built it. But that's the only option we ever had at WCW. We were never able to get a date at the Garden. WWF had it locked up, and really locked up. We just would never closed back then. And we did run a couple shows at the theater, but it's just not a conducive venue for wrestling. It's a theater. Theaters and wrestling are usually not a real good mix, and a few exceptions the way they're built, but not this one. Beautiful room, just not great for wrestling.
Right. Yeah, I remember when they did call it the Felt Forum back in the day, when if there was a particularly hot angle when the WWF was running the Garden, they would have, if the arena sold out, they would then have the overflow watch the show, I guess, on a screen.
On the big screen from the Felt Forum.
From the Felt Forum. I think they did that for like, big matches with Snuka and Backlund and things of that nature.
Whenever the Garden was going to sell out, they would offer the closed circuit next door in the Felt Forum.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, just as an addendum to the story about the article I wrote for Rick and him quoting from it on Nitro, is, like I said, that was, I think, 1997. So 3 years later, I go to work for WCW as the editor of the magazine. And when I see Rick, the first thing he says to me, he immediately remembers me from the Baltimore Sun article and said it was one of the favorite articles that had ever been written about him, which of course was very flattering to hear. And then he asked me if I could get him a copy of it, because he wanted to have it framed and put up on his wall in his house, in his office.
Wow.
So
nice.
I thought, wow, yeah, you can't ask for a bigger compliment than that.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me ask you this, your favorite Ric Flair opponent, favorite program that he was involved in, if I had to pin you down and ask you for I know it's probably hard because he's had so many great matches, so many great opponents. What would you say?
I think probably his long-term program with Ricky Steamboat. And the reason I say that is just because I really appreciated the matches themselves. Ricky Steamboat, probably the best pure babyface of that era. And of course, Flair is a heel in that program, but the matches themselves, move for move, were just amazing. The one that sticks out the most in my mind is Chi-Town Rumble. I think it was 1989 when Steamboat took the belt from Flair, the NWA belt. I didn't know the finish. I usually don't know the finishes. I don't want to know the finishes. And I didn't know that was coming. And it was just a phenomenal match with a great finish. And they put the belt on Ricky Steamboat, and then had a great program after that, and several high-profile matches that were just terrific. And they were all matches that were probably between 50 and 60 minutes long. It's just the type of match that those two athletes could have. So as we talked about earlier, Rick worked with just the cream of the crop of that era. But I think his matches with Ricky Steamboat were absolute classics, and people can see those online now and judge for themselves. But for anyone who likes old school wrestling from that era, those matches are just terrific.
Oh, there's no question, no question at all about that. And we talked earlier about the magic with Rick and Dusty, but that was a lot of it. Even though the matches were great, a lot of it was based on theater and the larger than life personalities and the storylines with that. With Rick Steamboat and Ric Flair, it was, yes, there were angles and they were in a feud, but it was so much about just the chemistry that the two of them had, even from a technical standpoint, which is, I know what you're referring to, just the way they worked with each other. Dave Meltzer has told the story that some of the greatest Flair Steamboat matches were seen only by people in the arena in the Carolinas back in the territory days. They weren't filmed, they weren't recorded for TV. And those were some classics because they had the feud in the Mid-Atlantic area for many years.
Well, sure. And they also had the first main event of the shows at the Meadowlands with Pro Wrestling USA in 1985.
Right. And, you mentioned Chi-Town Rumble. I would throw in another match that's one of my favorite of all time is the 2 out of 3 falls match they had. I believe it was in New Orleans.
Yeah, in New
on
Orleans.
the same day as WrestleMania 4, maybe.
Yeah.
That was an incredible match, which I think went like 55 minutes or,
And both Vern Gagne trainees.
Exactly. And, I also interviewed, I'll refer once again to that Ric Flair article that I wrote for the Baltimore Sun. I interviewed Rick Steamboat as well for that article because he was, Rick named him as his favorite opponent of all time. And so I caught up with Rick Steamboat and asked him about working with Rick. And he said that there really was this, there was no animosity between them. It was almost a friendly, competitive rivalry as to, they pushed each other because they were both in such great cardiovascular shape, both so good at what they did inside the ring, and they pushed each other to their limits. And that's why those matches were so good.
Agreed. They definitely did. And they just put on clinics.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank everyone for listening. If you're a fan of Old School in Session, please spread the word. And as a reminder, we will have a new episode every Wednesday right here on Ring of Honor's YouTube channel. To submit a question for Gary, you can do so on Twitter using the hashtag AskGary and also on Ring of Honor's Facebook page. For Gary Juster, this is Kevin Eck, and Old School is out. Until next week.